All right, let's mark the calendar. It is Tuesday, February 3rd, 2026. And if you've been scrolling through any news feeds this morning, really any time in the last 48 hours, there is one headline that is it's absolutely dominating the cycle.
Oh, you can't miss it.
You really can't. It reads, "Why Republicans are finally confronting Trump's emergency powers."
It is the headline of the week.
Yes.
But honestly, when I first saw that, my eyes just locked onto one specific word. I think you know which one.
Finally.
Exactly. That six-letter word is doing some incredibly heavy lifting there. I mean, a source material we're digging into today argues that this single word, finally, it carries the weight of years of silence.
Years of looking the other way.
Exactly.
And that's really the premise of our deep dive today. We need to figure out why now. It's February 2026.
Yeah.
You're deep into this administration's term. So why has the Senate suddenly decided to, wake up? Is this some return to constitutional principles?
Or is it something a little more primal?
Survival instinct.
Right. The source offers this really vivid, slightly gross analogy right off the bat. It compares these politicians to rats on a ship.
Oh, I saw that.
And the point they make is that rats don't leave the ship just because the captain is shouting nonsense. They don't leave because the navigation is a little off. They leave when the water hits their ankles.
And the argument here is that in 2026, the water isn't just rising, it's freezing cold, and it's ankle deep.
Precisely. But to understand why the water's rising, we have to look at where the leak is coming from. And that brings us to the core of this whole thing, the emergency addiction.
This is one of those topics that sounds so dry on the surface. The National Emergencies Act, IEPA. But it's actually the operating system for how the government is running right now.
It's the easy button.
Right. I think most people assume that when we talk about emergency powers, we're talking about, nuclear war or a massive earthquake.
The sky is literally falling.
Exactly. Moments like that.
And that was the design. These laws were created for catastrophes where Congress, which, let's be honest, moves at the speed of a glacier, couldn't act fast enough to save the country. They were meant to be shields.
But over the last few decades, and especially now, they've turned into a sword, a workaround for when you can't get a budget passed.
Or when you want to pass a policy that you know doesn't have the votes. The source describes this as an addiction, but they don't just blame the president. They actually call Congress the drug dealer.
Which is a harsh metaphor, but it tracks. Congress is the enabler. It's a game of heads I win, tails you lose.
Totally. If a president declares an emergency and it works, Congress says, look, we supported him, great job. If he declares an emergency and it breaks the economy, they say, look at this tyrant, we had nothing to do with it.
It allows them to keep their fingerprints off the weapon. But I do want to push back on this a little, or at least play devil's advocate. Wasn't there an attempt to fix this? I remember reading about the National Emergencies Act of 1976. That was post-Watergate.
Yeah.
The whole point was to put a leash on the executive branch.
You're absolutely right. That was the intent. The 1976 Act was supposed to be the check. The idea was, sure, the president can declare an emergency, but Congress had to review it every 6 months. They had to vote to keep it alive.
So, what happened? What went wrong?
Well, two things, really. First, a Supreme Court case called Ines v. Chadha.
Ah, I recall this. This is the one that killed the legislative veto, right?
Bingo! It basically ruled that Congress can't just overturn a president's decision with a simple vote unless the president also signs it, which of course he would never do. It legally neutered the 1976 Act. But the second thing is just, well, pure political laziness.
How so?
Since 1976, do you know how many times Congress has successfully voted to terminate a national emergency against a president's will?
Given where this conversation is going, I'm assuming it's very low.
0.
Not once.
Not a single time. In fact, until recently, they barely even bothered to have the debate. We have what the source calls zombie emergencies. I love this stat. The United States is technically still in a state of emergency regarding Iran, dating back to 1979.
1979. So Jimmy Carter was in the White House, disco was on the radio, and that legal state of emergency is still on the books today.
Still active. And look, if an emergency lasts for nearly 50 years, it's not an emergency, is it? It's just policy. It's just the wallpaper.
But the shift we're seeing in 2026, the reason for this so-called revolt, is that this administration found the loophole in that 1976 Act. And it is a big one.
Oh, it's the Grand Canyon loophole. The act details all the procedures, how to file the papers, how to publish it, but it has one fatal flaw. It never defines what an emergency actually is.
It's just blank.
It's a blank check. It is entirely up to the discretion of the president. So if the president wakes up one morning and decides that imported German cars are a threat to national security, boom, national emergency. If he feels the border isn't secure, boom, emergency.
And that pivot, using these powers for economic policy, that's where we need to stop and really drill down, because this isn't just about senators arguing in some hearing room. This is the tariff trap. And this is what's hitting everyone listening right in their wallet.
This is where the abstract legal theory meets your grocery bill.
So the source argues this Republican revolt isn't happening because senators suddenly found their constitutional compasses. It's happening because their donors, the construction companies, manufacturers, retailers, they're screaming.
They are screaming because their profit margins are being erased. And we need to clarify something here because there's so much misinformation about tariffs. The source calls the idea that foreign countries pay these tariffs a beautiful, seductive lie.
You hear it all the time at rallies, right? We are taxing China. We are taxing Mexico.
But that's not how the mechanics of trade actually work. When a shipment of steel or electronics hits a U.S. port, China doesn't write a check to the Treasury. Mexico isn't Venmoing Uncle Sam. The importer pays that tax.
So that means Walmart. That means Ford. That means your local hardware store owner.
Exactly. And let's go a layer deeper because the source really emphasizes the cash flow problem here. It's not just that things get more expensive. These businesses have to pay that tariff up front to customs before the goods are even released.
So if you're a small business importing parts, you're basically giving the government an interest-free loan just to get your inventory, months before you can even sell it.
Right. It crushes their cash flow. And what do? They don't just eat that loss. They pass it on. They have to. It is, functionally, a sales tax in disguise.
And the tool being used for this is Section 232, is that right? That's the specific power?
Yes. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. It allows for tariffs specifically in the name of national security. Now, historically, that meant things like, tanks, uranium, fighter jet components.
Things you actually need to fight a war.
Yes. But in 2026...
What's national security now?
We've stretched that definition to the breaking point. The administration has argued that national security includes Canadian lumber, German SUVs, French wine.
Okay, I love a good bottle of wine, but I'm struggling to see how it threatens the sovereignty of the United States.
Well, the argument is that economic security is national security. But the real-world result is this sticky inflation we can't seem to shake. The source highlights that economists are now estimating these emergency tariffs are adding nearly a full percentage point to inflation.
Which explains why, even though interest rates might be stable, prices for so many things just aren't coming down. Housing materials, cars.
And that's the trap. Once you protect an industry with tariffs like domestic steel, they scream if you try to take them away. But if you keep them, the rest of the economy screams because costs are too high. The president has painted the entire economy into a corner with a brush-marked emergency.
So you've got donors angry about profits. You have voters angry about the price of eggs. That explains the domestic pressure. But we have to pivot now to the other side of the Atlantic, because there is a second emergency brewing, and this one involves nukes and treaties.
The NATO nervous breakdown.
The source material gets pretty dark here. It describes the president's view of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not as this grand alliance of democracies, but as a landlord-tenant dispute.
Tony Soprano geopolitics is the phrase they used. Pay up, or nice country you got there, shame if something happened to it.
Now, to be fair, the source does admit there's a valid grievance here. Europe has been underinvesting in its own defense for decades.
Oh, absolutely. The free rider problem is real. No one disputes that. But the source argues that while the grievance is valid, the method is dangerous. It's not negotiation. It's threatening to burn the whole house down.
And the specific fear keeping Senate hawks like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell up at night is that the president might unilaterally withdraw from NATO. Just leave.
And this is where we hit another one of these constitutional blind spots. The Constitution is crystal clear on how to get into a treaty. You need a 2/3 Senate vote. It's a high bar.
But it doesn't say how to get out.
Nothing. Silence. Total silence. And historically, there's a precedent, Goldwater v. Carter in '79, where the Supreme Court basically threw up its hands and said, this is a political question, we're not getting involved.
So legally, the president might actually have the power to wake up, send a tweet saying, we're out, and just shatter the alliance.
That is the fear. And Congress knows this. In fact, didn't you see that provision they snuck into the National Defense Authorization Act recently?
Right. They passed a law that explicitly says the president cannot withdraw from NATO without Senate approval. They tried to handcuff him.
They did. But, and here's why the source is so skeptical, Does that law actually matter if the president declares a national emergency?
If he declares that some imminent danger requires immediate separation from the alliance.
Exactly. He could argue that the emergency powers override that statute. He could order troops out of Germany or Poland before the courts could even schedule a hearing. By the time the lawyers get to the Supreme Court, the troops are gone and the alliance is broken.
That is the nervous breakdown.
Yeah.
The Senate realizes they handed the keys to the car to someone who likes driving off-road, and now they are scrambling to grab the wheel from the back seat.
Which brings us to the spine inspection. We know why they are panicking, their donors are losing money, and the global order is shaking. But who is actually leading this revolt?
The prognosis from the source is, well, it isn't great. It basically breaks the GOP Senate into two camps, and neither of them really come out as heroes in this story.
You have the old guard, right? Led by McConnell, the institutionalists.
And their motivation is just pure survival.
It's polls. They see the suburban voters fleeing. They see the midterms coming up in November. McConnell wants to save the Senate majority. He's trying to put a check on the chaos, not because he disagrees with the policy necessarily, but because the instability is bad for business and bad for elections.
And then you have the concerned caucus. Your Susan Collinses, your Mitt Romneys. The source uses a term I found really interesting here, the hallway pass.
Yeah, this is pure DC insider mechanics. The hallway pass is when leadership allows a senator to go to the microphones and express deep concern. They let them vote no on some procedural motion to look independent for the voters back home.
But there's a catch.
The catch is they are only allowed to do it if their vote doesn't change the outcome. It's calculated theater, kabuki theater, as the source calls it. They get the credit for being a maverick without any of the risk of actually stopping the agenda.
But there's a new group now, right? The New Guard. The J.D. Vances, the Josh Hawleys.
Yeah.
And the source argues they're playing a completely different game.
This was the most fascinating insight for me. The civil war inside the party isn't just about Trump. It's generational. And the New Guard, they don't want to limit these emergency powers.
Even though they're fighting with the White House on some of this stuff now.
Correct. Because they are looking ahead to 2028. They are thinking, wait a minute, in a few years, maybe I will be the one in the Oval Office. Why would I want to throw away this magic wand right before I get to use it?
That is a terrifying thought. They aren't fighting for the Constitution. They are preserving the weapon for their turn.
That's it. They want to use those same emergency powers to do their own version of radical change, maybe on tech companies or universities. So they'll perform this spine inspection, but they won't actually vote to strip the power away.
So if we look at this big confrontation that's in all the headlines, the source just calls it a bluff. A Goldilocks strategy.
Too hot to ignore, too cold to actually stop. They want to distance themselves enough to survive the midterms, but not so much that they start a total war with the base. Because let's not forget, the primary voters, they love the results.
They love the border control, the deregulation.
Right. So the senators are stuck between a donor class that wants stability and a voter base that wants the chaos.
Okay, let's bring this all together. We've unpacked the legal history, the economic pain of the tariff trap, the geopolitical risk to NATO, and the cynical politics of the Senate. The source ends with a verdict. Is the Republic being saved this week?
The verdict is guilty. Guilty of negligence.
That's harsh.
It is, but the evidence supports it. The argument is that this revolt is really a negotiation of surrender, not a revolution. They are trying to negotiate terms where they can save face, but the emergency state continues.
So what's the outlook then? What happens next?
The prediction is a watered-down compromise bill, something that looks great on a campaign flyer. Maybe it says, the president must report to Congress every 90 days instead of every 6 months. You know, something that sounds tough.
But the tariffs stay.
The tariffs stay. The power to withdraw from NATO via emergency declaration, it stays. The bill will be toothless.
And that leads to the source's final point. If the politicians are just playing games, what are you, the listener, supposed to do?
The source has a very specific call to action here, and it's simple. Ignore the noise, ignore the tweets, ignore the speeches on the Senate floor where they sound very, very concerned.
What should we watch instead?
Watch the roll call votes.
The actual record.
The record. Who actually votes to strip the powers? Who puts their name on the line to say no when it really matters? Because the incentive structure in Washington only changes if citizens stop rewarding the theater.
The source draws a distinction here that really stuck with me. The difference between being a citizen and being a subject.
It's a powerful way to frame it. The source argues that a subject waits for the king to be nice. A subject just hopes the leader's benevolence will lower the price of eggs. A citizen makes the king listen.
And if Congress won't do its job, if they refuse to check the executive branch,
Then the source suggests the voters have a duty to fire them all.
clean house.
If the institution is broken, re-electing the same people who broke it, whether they are old guard or new guard, isn't going to fix it.
It's a sobering deep dive today. We started with a headline about a political fight, and we ended up uncovering a system that's just addicted to shortcuts. A system where the word emergency has basically lost all meaning.
And if everything is an emergency, then nothing is. We're just living in a permanent state of exception.
And here's the final thought I want to leave you with, something the source hinted at, and we touched on with the new guard. If these emergency powers are so addictive, and if we establish that the president can unilaterally rewrite economic and foreign policy, what happens when the other side wins?
That's the nightmare scenario, isn't it? You spend years building this machine that bypasses all the checks and balances because you like the guy in charge. But eventually, the guy in charge changes.
And suddenly you realize you've built a weapon that is now pointed right back at you. Something to think about while you're paying for those eggs. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
We'll catch you next time.